Welcome to A Quaker Take on allyship. A Quaker Take is a podcast from Quakers in Britain where we discuss and open up a conversation about different perspectives on the world.
So why allyship today?
Allyship is increasingly a word that is being used. It's a concept that's really important. And, when we're looking and seeing increased prejudice in the world, anti-Muslim hate crime, anti-transgender hate crime, all of the reports of that kind of going up in society, it's really important to think about allyship in terms of a struggle for equality and justice. Quakers are part of all of these movements, and it's particularly relevant to kind of working alongside people. And so we wanted to talk about allyship today because that's one part of us all beginning to think about that and thinking about the use of our own power, the privilege that we might have in society. And really the question is very much about how do we be an ally and what does it mean to practice allyship today?
Yeah, so by being part of these movements and seeking to support them, it's about questioning how we do what we do. Quakers have a history of siding with the marginalised. We're keen to intervene in work that turns back the tide of hatred and violence. So there's a lot of sense of wanting to do stuff in the world at the moment. And this is all about, being active in the world today. It's like, how can we collaborate if groups are being, particularly if certain groups are being oppressed, how do we support those groups? But it's also about, it's about all of us. And we've made a commitment, Quakers that is, to think about these issues and how it affects us within our communities, within the Quaker community, within society, and within those movements for change.
Partly also about asking who's making that change, who's in the room, whose voices are being listened to, and how do we support that to happen as well? Yeah,
so this is really big and important stuff that's part of a much broader conversation as well that, we'll be continuing in other podcasts and out there and is happening. And we're not going to sort of, define allyship today and then move on. It's not like a tight, concise podcast because that's not really in the spirit of what it's about. Instead, we've got a couple of really interesting interviews. So it's quite a long episode. Feel free to stop halfway and listen to it in two parts, or, however you like to listen to podcasts. But yeah, having space to reflect is helpful on this one. I know I certainly found that helpful after listening to the interview that you did with Tatiana.
I was talking to Tatiana a little bit about how allyship fits in the way that she does supporting sanctuary Quaker meetings around the country.
And then that leads into a conversation that takes up the second half of this podcast that I had with Marcus Rediker, who is a professor of history at the University of Pittsburgh. He's the author of a book called The Fearless Benjamin Lay, which is about an early 18th century Quaker abolitionist. And I ask him sort of why this story is important in the current context, why it matters, and why revisiting our history, whether that be generally or particularly Quaker history, is useful to our understanding. But yeah, over to you and Tatiana, I think.
I'm here with Tatiana Garavito, who's the Sanctuary Everywhere Programme Manager. That's quite a title, Tatiana. What does it actually involve?
Sure, hello. So I am the program manager of a piece of work that Quakers decided to do a couple of years ago. And the program works with groups of friends across the country that are interested in doing work around immigration or racial justice.
Cool. So why is that particularly important now? The whole hostile environment policies have been going on for quite a long time. Immigration detention centres have been around for more than a decade. Mm-hmm. So why now is there so much focus on this?
Well, I guess this community decided to work on these things because of the latest news about the refugee crisis. But I think the community has been interested in these things because we know that our immigration policy is rooted in racism, and this is an issue that has been going on forever.
So that's a kind of a long-term goal then, it's not a short-term project.
Yes, the community wants to do this work, and so the groups of friends of Quakers that are doing this work across the country have decided that their aim is to create a culture of welcome and hospitality. So friends are working with other organizations on the ground so that we can work in solidarity in our communities to stop these things from happening. They've also said that they're committed to working with groups opposing racism in all its forms. So we're working with anti-deportation groups, anti-detention. So yeah, we're doing all of that work as well as trying to change the law so that we can end detention, deportation and destitution.
Why is it important for Quakers to work on this issue?
I think we live in a system that that breathes and survives from the oppression of certain people. If you're a poor, if you are a person of color, or if you're a woman, for instance, or a trans person, you will face the injustices of the system more. So the issues that we're seeing around like migration, the fact that people are not being treated with respect and humanity, it's rooted in the system that we have. And so if we talk about justice, if we talk about peace, we need to talk about the immigration system.
So you were just talking about solidarity as well, and the importance of being in solidarity with the people affected, but also working with lots of different groups. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to be in solidarity with people?
So I think for me, and I think for the program that I run, working in solidarity means being with the other at their pain. So not feeling that we know more or that we are in a better position to help the other, but that we are going to be there wherever people are at. And I understand that all of us in our society have been harmed by a system that perpetuates violence in many different ways. So I am a person of color, I'm a migrant, and I am a woman. And because of, I guess, who I am and my identity, I have experienced, for instance, sexism, I have had to face the criminal justice system, and so on and so forth. Maybe you as a white person will have faced other things because of your class or because of your gender. And all of us, I think, have been, this is what I think, have been traumatized in various different ways. So working in solidarity is understanding that you and me can work together because we have that in common. And
okay.
That we think and create a better world for all of us if we work together, understanding that we have been traumatized or harmed in different ways. So I guess that's what I mean by solidarity.
When we're talking about solidarity and allyship, people talk a lot about power and privilege within that, and the idea that as a white person, I can be an ally to people of colour. What does that mean?
Yeah.
How does allyship work, and how can people kind of do that in their daily lives?
Sure. I think for me, again, I can't talk about everybody. So when we're talking about solidarity, for instance, and I think we talked about this last time, the definition or how solidarity can be exercised for me is different to another community or another person. And so I think solidarity also, going back to what we were talking about, needs to start from the understanding that we need to listen to each other so that we understand how to act in solidarity in the best way. And so allyship for me is not an identity. I think for me allyship is a status. So it's like, it's listening to the other person that you might be an ally to understand what is it that they're going through and to be there for whatever that community or that person needs. But it all starts by listening and understanding that people have been harmed, and that, when you're being harmed, when you're hurting, there are different things that you might feel that are needed in a moment like that. So I guess when I can be an allyship to a migrant or a refugee community, for instance, in my daily job, and I think my responsibility is to understand that those people are hurting, and that for me to be able to support that community or that person, first of all, I need to be with them at their pain. So just be there to listen, and then from that, sort of grow or create a way of working that starts from that understanding and from that listening.
Okay.
Yeah.
And if people don't have that direct experience of sitting down with people and listening in that direct way, what does it mean to be an ally if, say, your majority community around you actually looks very similar to you? Mm-hmm. How do you be an ally in those circumstances?
I think at this moment in time, we have so much information online, and there are a lot of people from various communities that are writing about their experiences. So I think if you don't have a person or a community that is there in person, you can still write, you can still listen and read stuff about from activists that are actually going through, or communities that are going through these things. So we actually wrote a resource, for instance, and this is actually for friends or Quakers that might not have those communities to talk to. At the end of the resource, of the guide, there's a list of books and podcasts that people can listen to so that they can start understanding those experiences.
Yeah, so if you can't find the direct experience, go and look for it.
For me, at this moment in time, I am interested in how we heal as a society, because I often talk about how race, class, gender are constructs, social constructs that we've created and through which we see ourselves and label ourselves. And so being white, for instance, is also a label. And it's a label that means that, this whole system helps you in so many different ways. But I also feel that that's a trauma. Because to be privileged in society every day by your skin color I think for me, is a trauma as well. So there is a really, really good podcast called Healing Justice that comes from that talks about how we need to heal and actually how we can heal collectively. So it's a really, really good podcast that I recommend. But there are other resources that we can also.
Okay.
I mean, the other thing that I was just going to say before is that I remember I came across, I have various friends that might not have trans friends or or people of color friends, or sometimes even women, so many women as friends. And I think starting to read books, it doesn't have to be on these topics, but books from people from those identities is a very good place to start.
Yeah, that helps you get into the skin of other people.
Yeah, in a way, yeah.
Okay. There are lots of people in the world who, and I guess I'm really talking about white people here, who feel like they don't have privilege in society, and that's not part of their identity. They people who do feel that they actually don't have a lot of power. How would you challenge that idea?
Maybe I can tell you about a few experiences that I have on my daily life that I don't think if you're white will experience. And so maybe we can start from that conversation. So when I'm going home, when I'm walking from the station to my house and it's around 11 or after 12, for instance, I feel really, really scared. And this is not something that only happens to me, but I think it happens to most women that I know. I think it's also your experience. Yep. And I feel scared because I feel that so many things can happen at that time. If I am walking through, I have to go through a little, alleyway. Yeah. I feel really scared that someone is going to jump and that I'm going to be maybe raped or robbed and that I won't, no one will be around. And okay, so that's one example. Another example is I am Colombian, I'm a migrant. And I sometimes have to go to meetings where I know that because of the way I speak, I'm not going to be seen as someone who knows what I'm talking about. And this happens to me all the time. And so I often have to sort of reassert my space, my position in many places because of that. So the same thing happens when because I am brown, then I have to go to policy meetings. And most of the people that are there are usually white. And again, because of my skin color, I'm often seen as someone that might not know how the British system works, or again, because I'm a woman, because I'm young, all of those things play an important role.
Lots of assumptions get made about you.
So many assumptions. Yeah, or for instance, I go to meetings where there's only men, and I don't feel comfortable in those places, and usually they don't listen to me, and there are so many things that happen. So I think for those who think that they are not privileged in society because of their skin color, I'll encourage them to think about what are some of the places where they feel uncomfortable. And maybe think about that there are some other people like myself, and I mean, although I'm brown, I am still seen as, well, I mean, if I was black, for instance, I think things will be a lot different for me as well. And I have friends who are black and they experience so many things. People come and touch their hair and, things like that. And so I think this is an invitation for those who think that they're not privileged to think about other people's experiences. And so I guess what I'm coming from is that we live in a system that sees whiteness as people who are more intelligent or or better, and that's because of all these social constructs that we have created. And so if you're a man, if you're a cis man, or if you're white, then you will have a lot more opportunities and will be seen in a different way in our society. So yeah.
Okay. I mean, lots of people have been throwing around the word intersectionality. In this circumstance, what do you think that?
I think it's quite, intersectionality is a way of understanding how all of these oppressions work. So the way I defined intersectionality is, as I was saying, a way to sort of understand how society and oppression works. So if you are a black trans woman in this society, you will be experiencing discrimination because of your gender, because of your skin color, because of, if you're poor, because of your class, if you're disabled, for instance, because of your ability or abilities. And so I guess intersectionality helps us understand all of these things and how they oppress and harm us in our world. But in the same way, it also helps us and encourages to understand that all of the work that we do, if we are able to connect it, we will be able to work in solidarity so that we can, grow together movements and change and transform the world in the ways that we want to transform them.
So if we have this understanding of the sort of different layers on which people are discriminated against within society, or that the structures of society are unequal in some way, how do we disagree and still be in solidarity with people?
This is a very, very interesting question, and one that is quite difficult for every one of us. I think, for instance, at the program that I run, we run something called Having Difficult Conversations. And it's a training for us to learn how to disagree and how to change people's views or perceptions that might be judgmental. And the techniques are really, really interesting because the techniques are things about like active listening and questions that we need to ask ourselves in order for us to understand where people are coming from. And so I think this is something that we need to try more. We need to listen more and we need to ask more questions, because something that I've realized is that when you disagree, we can disagree on many things, but then it's important to understand why is it that people are thinking the way they are thinking, because the background might be important to how people are thinking about things. So I think, you can be in solidarity with communities and you can still disagree on many things. And I think it's important to understand that, again, we are with people and communities at their pain, and that sometimes being with them is also disagreeing with them and just understanding that they might be at a different moment than ourselves. So I come from a family and from a society that is quite sexist. And I grew up in a family, that where I learned things that I don't think I should have learned. Mm-hmm. And for the last 3 or 4 years, I've been trying to unlearn patriarchy, which is basically what I learned when I was little, because of the different dynamics in my family. And I think that if you talk to me 5 or 6 years ago, maybe you will have disagreed with me and so many things to do with, feminism, for instance. Mm-hmm. But I think it is important to understand that background, that context in which people grew up or are also living. Mm-hmm. So that I think for me at the moment, we're coming from, or I understand the world and I understand ourselves from a position of trauma and harm. And a lot of the times when we disagree with people on things is because they might be traumatized and the stuff that they think about might come as quite different to the ways we think. But we need to understand that and be with people at wherever they are, and understand that little by little we can grow and learn and educate together to come to places where we can be more.
Mm. Yeah, I guess one of my questions there is around, sometimes it feels like when people do ask questions, in the sort of polarised world that we live in, there's an attitude of, well, how can you possibly not understand this? Let me dismiss your question, and like, how dare you even ask it? And how do we ask those questions in a way that is understood as coming from a place of wanting to understand more?
This is great because, I mean, I guess this is why this work is so important and so difficult, because we're talking about like the nuances of things. And I think, like, for instance, for me, something that I ask myself all the time is, what is my intention? What am I trying to get from this question? Or why am I even asking this? Why do I want to know this? You know? So I think this is something that all of us, each of us needs to ask when we are involved in something like that. So the intention, do we really want to know more? I mean, and how is this question and this relationship that I'm forming here going to help us transform the world? Because I don't think it's about being right. When I ask a question or when I say something, I don't want to be right, or I don't want to convince other people about the way I feel, but it's like, how can we transform ourselves in this communication that we're having?
Yeah.
And how is this transformation going to help the world become a better place? Now, I think because of the way how society works right now and the media and all of these things, there aren't enough spaces for these conversations and for the time that we need to have these conversations. And so everything is like, okay, let's just,
Definitely some people have been trying to take conversations off places like Twitter because actually it's not a conversation, it's just a shouting match.
It's a shouting. And I don't think any transformation can happen in those spaces. And I think everything that we do, the work that I do, the conversations that we have, we need to be very intentional, I think, in all of these conversations, communication, activism, actions that we're doing. Because at the end of the day, we just don't want to be right, as I was saying. It's about justice, and it's about the transformation that we need in society for us to become the people that we want to be in this planet. And this is the reason why I am moving myself towards the healing justice world, because I have seen how the power and privilege conversation and language is very intellectualized. So even the word allyship or solidarity is like up here. It's like it's very academic. But for me, this is not about that. For me, it's about how this feels in the body. Where is the pain coming from? What does it remind us of? Does it come from our childhood? And I think it's there in trauma and in healing that we will be able to meet together and heal and transform the world in the ways that we want to transform the world.
It's going back to that whole idea of meeting people where they're at.
We live in a society for which it is easier to put people into blocks. And I am more and more interested in also coming out of the labels. So how can we see ourselves not as those social constructs, but as humans, Yeah. Humans who love, who can feel compassion for each other, who can grow, who can learn, who've been harmed, who are healing together. And I think in those places, I can see the humanity of people from wherever they come from a lot more. And that's where allyship and solidarity comes from, I think.
So for Quakers, that is often expressed as seeing that of God in every person, or answering that of God in every person. So if we think of allyship and solidarity as really living out that belief of answering that of God in other people, what does it mean within a faith community to be in solidarity with people?
Sure. Well, I come from a Catholic background, so we often say a similar thing, that there's that of God in everyone. But I think that sometimes what faith communities don't understand is that even though that's what we believe, again, we live in a system that doesn't see people and doesn't treat people in that way. So this is when the understanding of oppression comes quite handy, because if you are, again, a person of color or a woman or trans person, then the system will be treating you in a different way. And so I think for faith communities that have that understanding and that we are all equal human beings, again, that are harmed, that can love and feel compassion with each other, it is important to articulate how the system is treating people based on those identities in different ways, and how is it that we are working in solidarity with people who might be, facing those things. So I think the role of faith communities is very, very fundamental in bringing about the changes that we need, because there is that understanding. And also because faith communities come from a place of transformation, and it's not about the intellectualized way of, okay, we're all equal in society and everybody needs to, like most political organizations will say things like that. Mm-hmm. But a faith community comes from that understanding of
it's a deeper reality that sort of pushes.
Yeah, it's spiritual,
Yeah.
And so I think they have a very important role in articulating that.
Okay. And when it comes to dealing with history,
mm-hmm.
and a lot of the structures that we see within society that are causing some of these injustices in the world, they have quite a long history and they're going back decades and centuries.
Yeah.
How do you think we should be dealing with history, or whether that be of our own communities, of our faith communities, or even just within society generally?
Yeah. This is also very interesting because all communities around the world will have histories that we don't want to recognize, and who writes history. And so I think for communities, for every one of us, we need to understand where we come from. Like, we need to understand our past in order for us to start like creating a different future and to live in the present. So I think the first place to start is to put together that history and understand that we might have done beautiful things for the world, but we might also have done things that were not so good. And those two things, when we put them together and recognize them, we can start thinking about how to overcome, I guess.
Okay.
That's why it's so vital to learn about that. I also imagine, I grew up in Colombia, a region that was colonized by the Spanish. And school taught me that colonization had been a good thing for us, and that we had been, in a way, civilized by the process of colonialism. That, in a way, white people from Europe had come to Latin America to kill everyone and to take everything, and that had been a good process. So I only came to understand about my history, and not because of our education system, but because of my own process of trying to understand the world. Imagine how beautiful it will be for us to have learned all of those things when we were at school. So it's good to understand, like, maybe, the good things that might have happened, but also the bad things, and then let people, come out to their own conclusions and let them organize in the ways that they want,
Yeah. Well, it's been really great chatting to you, Tatiana. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
I really enjoyed listening to that. I think just taking the time to talk about those things, actually, and also listening to different people's experiences, and I completely agree with what she said there, that's what it's got to be about.
Yeah, I think the power of listening really came over really strongly to me about about educating yourself, that going and reading from different perspectives and listening to people and really kind of trying to understand the world a bit more from different perspectives, that was quite an important part of being a really good ally.
Yeah, totally. And as a Quaker, I find that really interesting, because that seems to be absolutely at the core of what Quakerism is. It's about equality, it's about listening to people, it's about challenging injustice, speaking truth to power. But a core of it is, we tend to talk about it a lot in the context of faith. Different people have different understandings, but also different people have different experiences. And you can't separate somebody's experience of growing up and injustice and living out in the world, separate it from their spiritual experiences. It's one and the same, and that's what Quakers think. So having that space to talk to each other and listen to that, it's got to be important, and to listen to those beyond all of the world around us, and make sure that we're not not got our heads down and are blind to these really important things and these struggles.
I think it's really easy to be accidentally blind to the experiences of others, and you sort of just need to I don't know, get the right pair of glasses or something, so that you can actually look at the world in a slightly different way.
Yeah, I had a slightly eccentric politics lecturer who used to talk about lenses. He's like, go find another lens, go relook at it with a different lens. I think it's a helpful way of thinking, are you always looking at it with your lens? Because this stuff affects everyone, and I mean, that obviously came across, I think.
And I think that's really important when we're thinking about, like, at the current context, but then what does that mean if we're looking at history, and can we frame this also in a way of looking at historical figures in the way that they behaved as well?
Yeah, totally. And you talked a lot about the history and the context that gets us to where we are. And I've been exploring certain aspects of Quaker history with Marcus Rediker, who is a bit of an expert on Benjamin Lay and early Quakers, particularly in America. So yeah, we just unpack that and look at the different people. And Marcus is American, so he's coming from a slightly different perspective, perhaps using slightly different language in this country, but really interesting and absolutely relevant stuff.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to listening to this.
My name is Marcus Rediker. I teach at the University of Pittsburgh. I'm a historian of early America and the Atlantic. I've written 7 books, and the most recent of them is The Fearless Benjamin Lay, the Quaker dwarf who became the first revolutionary abolitionist.
So what sparked your interest in Benjamin Lay initially?
Well, he was an example of the way in which the resistance of 1730s was driving abolitionist thought. Benjamin Lay was one of the first people to call for the immediate worldwide abolition of slavery. Most people at that time who were critics of slavery simply said to slave masters, treat your slaves better. Benjamin Lay said, basically, I have a better idea. Free them. Free all of them. That's the only way to go. And I want you to do it right now, he says. A lot of people talked about gradual emancipation. This actually will go on for another 150 years. But Benjamin Lay said, no, it's got to happen immediately. So he really, on the one hand, is part of a kind of cycle of rebellion. But on the other hand, he stands out as someone who made especially radical demands.
Right. And my understanding of Benjamin Lay is that he spent a lot of his time campaigning within the Quaker community and trying to push them to see the way that he saw it. To what extent was the sort of calls that he was making at the time tied into this kind of wider Quaker movement? Was it springing from his Quaker faith, or was it?
Well, there are at least two questions in what you ask. One is how Benjamin Lay came to be an abolitionist at a time when there really wasn't an abolitionist movement. It's really not going to emerge as a major movement until the 1780s and 1790s. It's also important to know that although some Quakers had spoken out against slavery as early as 1688, there's the famous Germantown petition in which 4 Quakers expressed their opposition to slavery. The Quaker, the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting, which was the most important meeting in America, continually squashed any efforts to publish anti-slavery materials. This is because there were a lot of Quakers who owned slaves at that time. This is not very widely known, but Quakers not only owned slaves. One Quaker, who was an enemy of Benjamin Lay, was actually the architect of the Pennsylvania Slave Code,
right,
which contained a lot of violent punishments in it. So Benjamin Lay was kind of a lonely figure in many ways in daring to speak out against slavery. He did believe that some people supported his views, but that they were afraid to speak out against these weighty Quakers who were resolutely opposed to Lay's arguments about slavery.
That's really interesting because, of course, in many ways, I think Lay is important because he challenges this notion that we have now that Quakers are quite happy to kind of talk about how they were involved in trying to dismantle the slave trade, with conveniently forgetting this early stage.
Exactly. Quakers were really not unusual in this regard. Most Europeans who came to America, who migrated to America in the 17th and 18th century, who grew wealthy, bought slaves. That's what wealthy people did. And there's the old saying that Quakers came to America to do good and ended up doing well. They did well because of the richness of land, which they gained from Native America. And they did that, I want to emphasize, nonviolently, unlike almost everyone else. And actually, Benjamin Lay was proud of that. He was proud of the negotiations with Native Americans in Pennsylvania, which did not result in Indian wars, actually until later when Quakers had lost political control of the colony. Yeah. So that's one reason that many Quakers grew wealthy. Another reason many Quakers grew wealthy was through trade. There were a great many merchants who were involved in trading with the extremely wealthy and dynamic Caribbean slave colonies. A lot of Quaker merchants played a role in that, in providing materials, food, other such things to the slave colonies like Barbados and Jamaica. So Quakers were involved in slavery in a lot of different ways, and that is a very important thing. Benjamin Lay had lived in Barbados for about a year and a half, where he saw slavery in all of its horrors very closely. He saw the violence, he saw torture, he saw executions, he saw bodies mangled by the production of sugar and machinery. He ended up being forced off the island, or choosing to leave, because he befriended Afro-Barbadian people. He and his wife Sarah Lay fed the hungry, and they denounced the source of misery for these people. And of course, the very powerful planters got wind of this and wanted them to leave. They ended up leaving for their own reasons, because they couldn't stand the violent horror of Barbados. So they went back to England for a time, and then in 1732 they migrated to Philadelphia. And when Benjamin discovered that not only was slavery there, but that Quakers were deeply involved in it, he was furious. So this is when he began a really militant campaign, specifically against Quaker slave owners. He felt that people who were Quakers, who owned slaves, were apostates to the faith.
Yeah, I mean it's a difficult one to think about, because in the sense that on paper it's so seemingly incompatible, which is interesting that was what Lay was sort of trying to advocate for the time. And I suppose that.
But see, here's why we need to go back to people like Benjamin Lay, because since Quakers became the first religious group to ban slavery in their midst, that finally happened in 1776, but it took almost a century of debate before they could do it. It's become then the common sense afterwards that Quakers were always opposed to slavery.
Yeah.
And that's just not true. Benjamin Lay was vilified, he was despised, he was mocked, he was disowned 4 times. Yeah. He was the most disowned Quaker in the 18th century, I think. And I think this is just a very important part of Quaker history. And one of the reasons why Benjamin Lay is so little known today is because of the original Quaker repression in booting him out, and denouncing his book at every opportunity. The Philadelphia Yearly Meeting placed ads in the newspapers denouncing the book. Of course, the book explained his struggle against these wealthy Quaker slave owners, and they were furious about it. But we need to know that there was a very serious struggle inside the Quaker community about slavery, and Benjamin Lay was really the heart and soul of it. He was extremely militant. At every meeting he drew a line and he said, are you for slavery or are you against it? There's no middle ground. You're either for it or you're against it. And slowly he began to change the hearts and minds of the Quaker rank and file, because the 20 years when he was the leading voice against slavery is precisely the time when more and more Quaker people began to change their minds and to oppose the practice.
And do you think he was instrumental in that?
Definitely. In fact, it's impossible to think that he didn't have a great deal to do with it, because he was one of the very few speaking out against slavery in that time period. Now, in the 1750s, when a younger generation of Quakers came into leadership, after some of those others who had been Benjamin Lay's enemies either died or became old and stepped down, then you had a group of people, many of whom had already been influenced by Benjamin Lay, reaching policy-making positions. So things really began to change then. This is when people like John Woolman and Anthony Benezet, sort of the next generation, come into public view, and they actually have rightly received a lot of credit for organizing this movement. But Benjamin Lay, as the bad boy of Quaker abolitionism, has been, I think, quite seriously forgotten by most. And then let me add this. He was very deeply a Quaker. He loved the Quaker faith. He didn't love Quaker slave owners, but he loved the Quaker faith. This meant everything to him. And it's actually an important statement that he was willing to be disowned for his principles, because he dearly loved that. Now, it's been a very important development since the book was published that two Quaker communities who disowned Benjamin in the 18th century have now taken him back. This began in the Abington monthly meeting. This is a town outside of Philadelphia. This is where Benjamin was a member. He was finally disowned by them in 1738. I gave a couple of talks there, and this prompted a discussion, and actually I'll call it a debate, about what should be done about Benjamin Lay. Some people wanted him to be rehabilitated and acknowledged as a member of the community. Others were opposed. Finally, it was decided that the Quaker meeting did not have a means to readmit the dead, because one can't finally know whether they want to be readmitted or not. So some people who were very keen to remember Benjamin Lay came up with a really interesting alternative. They proposed a minute, a formal declaration that would declare Benjamin Lay to have been a friend of the truth, and that they would declare unity with his spirit. And this minute was accepted unanimously. And so that is, to me, a very important step. Shortly after that happened, only about 2 weeks, Tim G. led a similar type of movement in the North London Quaker meeting, who adopted, I think, an almost identical minute. So to me, these are extremely moving and important steps to take, because what it means is that people now recognize that he was right.
Yes.
He was right, and the people who disowned him for his anti-slavery activism were wrong. And I think this is really significant.
It sounds like you were kind of very personally motivated to play a role in that, and you're giving the talk. So I just wondered what your you feel this is a really important step. I kind of wondered what your personal kind of thoughts are.
Well, my whole working life, John, as a historian, has been to try to bring back those histories of popular struggle that have been suppressed. Mm. We have always had in the United States, and for a very long time in Britain as well, what I would call history from above, the history of the great men, the history of William Wilberforce, the history of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. Well, the kind of history I do, and there are a lot of people who do this very same kind of work, is we want to ask, what did Thomas Jefferson's slaves think? What did George Washington's soldiers think? What kind of contributions did ordinary working people make to the historical process? Let's look at the people who actually built America. Who built America is a question. Who built Great Britain? Mm-hmm. So in this sense, my work on Benjamin Lay is like work I've done on sailors, enslaved Africans, indentured servants, urban workers, all kinds of people who are really quite unknown. But I did have a special interest in Benjamin Lay, because I think there's an emerging understanding in the United States that slavery and the struggle against slavery are absolutely central to our history. I mean, just fundamental. And that even goes to show that the legacy of slavery is still very much a live issue in the United States. That history lives on in discrimination, poverty, deep structural inequality, racialized incarceration. Slavery is still very much with us. So when I learned about Benjamin Lay, I thought, well, here's a person who was on the right side of history. He's actually a much better and more proper historical hero than people like Jefferson or Washington, who were both slave owners. So let's talk about him. Let's talk about his contribution to American history. And he was actually someone who suffered repression for daring to say the things he said. So I think we need people like Benjamin Lay. And for example, as the statues of Confederate generals come down, I'd like to see statues of Benjamin Lay go up. And I'll tell you one other thing relatedly. Not long after I published the book, The Fearless Benjamin Lay, an anonymous group was formed on Facebook called the Benjamin Lay Society, which has one demand. They want to take the statue of William Penn on top of Philadelphia City Hall down. William Penn was a slave owner. He owned 12 slaves, and they want to put a statue of Benjamin Lay up there instead.
Yeah. I was going to ask you two questions, but I'm now so tempted to ask that question about the whole William Penn thing, because do we reevaluate people like William Penn? Do we take the good and the bad of them and kind of acknowledge it's complicated? Do we disown them historically? And it's just a really challenging and interesting question.
What you've described is a process that all societies go through more or less continuously. We're always reevaluating our history. And it's not because the history itself changes, but because the questions that we ask about it in the present change. So Great Britain in the 19th century, which is full of moral superiority for having been the first to abolish the slave trade, and then slavery, and those are very important historical developments, is a very different sort of society than one today in which racism and the issues of slavery and empire are still very serious issues. Racism is on the rise, I think, both here and in the United States. So these are very good reasons to revisit history. I do think it's important that we reevaluate the past in light of our vision of the present and the future. And here's a way that someone like Benjamin Lay is really important. One of the common defenses of Thomas Jefferson, for example, is for people to say, oh, well, he was a kind of victim of the plantation system, and besides, to say otherwise is to smuggle contemporary values back into his era. And that's not fair. That's anachronistic. Well, I'm going to judge him by Benjamin Lay's values. Benjamin Lay was his contemporary. So it's not true that there weren't people in the 18th century indicting slave owners and condemning the institution of slavery. That was something that was there. And I think this is part of the importance of Benjamin Lay. He does show that it was possible at that time to think that slavery could be abolished and should be abolished.
So if I was listening to this podcast and I was thinking, oh, this is sort of very interesting kind of historical stuff, it's relevant to Quakers, what would sort of your kind of answer to be? Sort of why should we care about Benjamin Lay? Like, why should the wider society in Britain care about a radical who did some stuff hundreds of years ago in America?
I think its importance today is that if you think that struggles against injustice are important, if you think that many of the best things about contemporary society are things that have been won, for example, in the United States by the Civil Rights Movement and the Black Power movement and the anti-war movement and the women's movement, just to use a few examples. If you think that our progress is linked to those struggles, to people fighting for their rights, then someone like Benjamin Lay is extremely important, because he is someone who was fighting hard at a time when slavery was just the common sense of the day. And this was really remarkable. So we do need to look back and make people like Benjamin Lay part of our history. I mean, he can be an inspiration. He can be an inspiration to people who think, well, that's just unchangeable. Well, if ever there was what seemed to be an unchangeable institution, it was slavery in the 18th century. I mean, economic interests were so deep and so powerful. Slave traders, plantation owners, the government deeply invested in slavery. And so here's this lone voice. He many times felt like he was crying in the wilderness, but eventually his side won. That is a remarkable story. We need these people. It's not that they need us, we need them. We need examples of their courage. We need examples of their success, to know that you can fight for things and win even when it seems almost impossible. I do want to emphasize that Benjamin Lay's life as a dwarf was a significant part of his radicalism. And here's why. He didn't talk about it very much. I think he wanted to be known for his ideas, not for his size. But there is no doubt that he was ridiculed, he was mocked, people made fun of him all the time because he had a dwarf body. He also had kyphosis, the curvature of the thoracic vertebrae, what's called a hunchback. I'm absolutely convinced that going through life and suffering the sometimes humiliating treatment that he got at the hands of other people definitely expanded his empathy, made him really recognize what other people went through. I think this was a very significant part of who he was. And I do give the Quakers credit, but I think Benjamin was undoubtedly attracted to the Quaker ethic of equality. And I think he basically held his Quaker communities to that. He would say every day, I mean, as a little person, it was a struggle every day to be treated equally. And Benjamin would say, you're going to treat me equally. I demand it. And I demand that you treat those enslaved people equally too. So in some ways, he was kind of a conscience of the group. Do you really believe in the golden rule? Do you believe in it, or do you just pretend to believe in it? Right? He was that really difficult person who was always asking the hard questions. So, but I do want to emphasize that his life as a little person was definitely part of it.
Thank you.
Okay, my pleasure.
I find it particularly interesting that he decided that what he needed to do, and I'm sure he was part of like a broader movement and everything, but that one of the things he felt was really important to do was about talking to his own community and challenging them and challenging each other to try and stop owning people. And that was where he started.
Yeah, that it's wrong for him to own slaves and it's wrong for him to sit next to somebody in a meeting that did. And that's what the thing that seemed to really irk him, that he felt that this was so obvious and so irreconcilable with the foundations of his religious community that he spent so much time challenging it.
Yeah.
Probably in a way that was incredibly disruptive and frustrating for those people, but he was calling out something that
is so fundamentally wrong, and we understand now.
Yeah, but as Marcus went into, people did understand then, but maybe they just weren't.
They just didn't want to see it.
Didn't want to see it because it inconvenienced them.
Yeah.
But of course, in Benjamin Lay's case, right towards the end of his life, the message did get through, and he was, one of these pioneers, and the yearly meeting he was involved in, and then the subsequent yearly meetings, Britain yearly meeting, sort of around this time as well, did say this is wrong. And actually, having said that on multiple occasions, it finally said, no, this is wrong, and
we're going to kick everyone else out.
Everybody out who owned slaves. So he did get to see that, and then he did get to, and then after that, Quakers became this big force for campaigning against slavery around the world. Not on their own.
No.
But,
But in many ways, in solidarity with the people who were enslaved.
Yes, and from listening to those stories in some ways. Yeah, so it's just, I suppose, it's about reevaluating, isn't it? And I know that Marcus likes to frame it in terms of William Penn and Benjamin Lay. It's Penn, who, very well renowned Quaker, a lot of very inspirational writings, but was involved in the slave trade in one way or another.
Yeah, and people seem to sort of forgive him for that, and that sits very uncomfortably.
I think in some ways in this country we're not as far ahead with the thinking around some of this stuff, actually. You know, a lot of people assume, for example, that the kind of institutional racism we see in America, like the incarceration rates of black people in America, it's not the same here, but actually the incarceration rates of ethnic minorities in this country are really, really high, and you're more likely to be stopped and searched if you're black and things like that. It's actually is as bad over here, but we seem to be quite good at ignoring it, so I wonder if there's a factor there as well. And there's a whole secondary question there of if William Penn was involved in the slave trade on some level, either owned slaves or condoned it or whatever, didn't condone it, does that make him completely invalid as a historic figure or not?
Well, I guess that's the whole question around things like statues of different people, and how do we have a collective memory of the past, and can you? And if you have particular statues to people, do they need to come down? Do we need to have more honest statues? Do we need to have additional plaques saying, yeah, okay, they did this great thing, but they also did this really terrible thing, and we should remember both of those things?
Which is where I think it's important to come back to your conversation with Tatiana, where it's like, this can't be something that the same people are always deciding.
Yeah.
It's actually about listening to the voices of other people, and if a particular group is saying, we find this deeply problematic, we can't then just ignore that. We have to be like willing to hear that and be like, exactly. Oh, okay, we now are trying to understand this from your perspective. Interestingly, one of the reasons that this has come up, the whole Benjamin Lay thing, is because not only of the work of Marcus, but also Quakers in this country who stripped Benjamin Lay of his membership of Quakers at the time, who have gone back and kind of said, probably shouldn't have done that. The area meeting that Benjamin Lay would have been in now did a business meeting and passed a minute that I think is probably worth reading out. It says, Quakers are proud of the times in history when we have been ahead of our time on progressive social issues, but preceding those moments there have often been long periods where we have not walked down the path we would later understand to be the just one. At a time when racism seems as present and ugly as ever, both globally and nationally, and the structures of white supremacy are being defended and strengthened by powerful forces in our societies, this seems like a timely moment for North London area meeting to reflect on its involvement in the struggle for racial justice. And they minuted that they were unity in the spirit, I believe was the phrase that they used with Benjamin Lay. So yeah, no, interesting that, you know, Quakers are reevaluating this. I think this has definitely got to be the start of a conversation, both in terms of about the past and about Quakers and about the wider world, but also that importance of listening to people and different perspectives.
It's really part of what Quakers are currently doing, is having the conversation about what do we mean about inclusion and diversity, and how does it mean to be a faith community that is welcoming and inclusive. And so there's lots of people doing various different kinds of training and things at the moment. There's a national gathering happening in January next year. There's lots of different things happening, and it feels like there's a bit of a push to sort of challenge ourselves as well as challenge ourselves in the activism that we do as well. Yeah,
and there's that brilliant toolkit for action, owning power and privilege, that was kind of created around this brief, particularly for activists, but for anyone that sort of goes into these kinds of definitions and helps again start the thinking around it. I think particularly, you know, Quakers have this history around equality, you know, kinder transport and slavery. We often talk about those kinds of things, but there's having that commitment, and then there's also like, how does that work in the 21st century with listening to marginalised voices and standing alongside people, not doing things to people.
Yeah.
You know, not assuming you know what the problem is a really important thing about activism today.
Yeah, and something I think we all need to be aware of.
So it sounds quite apt that we would be asking you what your take is on all of this.
Yeah, so let us know what you think. You can find all the information about how to get in touch on the website at quaker.org.uk/podcast, where you can find all the details of the show notes and all the links to all the different things that have been mentioned in this episode.
And you can find us on social media at British Quakers. Yeah, and we want to know your take. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.